Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. I want to thank you for joining us today at this webinar titled The Effects of the Coronavirus Pandemic on North American Supply Chains, which is co-organized by the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute in Houston, Texas, and the U.S.-Mexico Foundation in Washington, D.C. As you well know, the public health crisis that we have faced in 2020 has had a very deep impact on our economic activity. One of those is the supply chains of international trade. Although we do not yet know the extent to which their activity has slowed down or how they've been affected, it is important to know exactly how they've been affected and when they will recover. The supply chains represent a vital nerve of our economy. They convey just about all the goods that we purchase and their parts from producers to consumers. To give us a preliminary understanding of the state of the supply chain's resilience, those effects that the pandemic has had on them, and when we can see their full recovery, we have a panel of knowledgeable guests today. They include Pia Orenius, Vice President and Senior Economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, Emilio Cadena, President and CEO of Grupo Prodensa in Mexico, and Flavio Volpe, Vice President of Canada's Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. So with that, let us begin this important event and conversation. Let me pass the microphone on to our colleague and first presenter, Pia Orenius of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Pia, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm excited to be with you this morning. So I'm going to give really the economic outlook and some of the implications for what's going on for North American supply chains. So starting off, let's see if I can get this to work. All right, let's start looking first at sort of the evolution here of the pandemic in US, Texas, and Mexico. So the chart I'm showing you here shows pretty dramatic declines in the daily growth rates of confirmed COVID-19 cases in all three countries. However, what we also see is sort of the stubborn persistence of growth rates. So even though growth rates in the United States of confirmed cases are down to 2%, they're down in Texas to 3%, those are still positive rates. And it also means that cases continue to grow and we have not yet peaked in terms of the prevalence of this pandemic. And certainly Mexico is probably a few weeks behind us. And so they also have a ways to go. What are the implications for this? Well, as Tony, as you pointed out, severe economic decline has followed what have been public and private health measures that are designed to prevent infection and spread of the coronavirus. Remote work is probably one of those policy implications that are less damaging to the economy, of course. But of course, we also know that only a minority of people can work remotely. And certainly in a place like Mexico, it's going to be an even smaller share of workers are prepared to work remotely. Policies like shelter-in-place policies and social distancing mandates, the closure of businesses, especially non-essential businesses and so forth, canceled events. We've seen how these policies have played out across the economy, really in record layoffs and record unemployment. Let me move on to show you. So where are we now in terms of social distancing as far as we can measure it? So these are high frequency measures of social distancing in the US and in Texas, and some variation here by metro area. But even across areas, you can see that social distancing has peaked. So what does that mean? We know that it's the social distancing, the decline in mobility, the business closures and so forth are the ones that are exacting the most economic harm, if you will. And so with the decline in social distancing, there is the possibility that economic activity is now bottoming out. And towards the end of this quarter, so maybe toward the end of this month and in June, things will begin to pick up. But what we know is also we're at extremely low levels of activity. So even if things are picking up, we're still 40% probably below where we should be in terms of economic activity. And certainly in Mexico, they have not yet seen the peak. And certainly they have not seen the bottoming out of economic activity either. So what are the economic sort of ramifications of what's going on? In the US, over 20 million jobs were lost just in April, according to the BLS. And as a result, the US unemployment rate has skyrocketed and Texas is expected to follow. So the US unemployment rate, we think, is at close to 15% currently, but of course it's an underestimate. We think the true unemployment rate is closer to 20%, and it will be continuing to rise. So the May number and possibly even the June number could be higher than what we're currently observing. And Texas is close behind. In terms of the forecast, though, the good news about the job losses so far is that about 80% of job losses nationally are temporary. So these people's jobs are still there. They're there for them to go back to. Of course, the longer this slowdown lasts, the less likely that the jobs will remain in place. But the fact that they're temporary layoffs means that, you know, there's some hope for a quick recovery. Now, quick recovery, certainly not as quick as we had hoped a couple of months ago, but we should begin to add back jobs in third quarter. So here I'm showing you US forecasts across sort of these large financial institutions. I took the average forecast there in the top row, and you can see whereas we are forecasting about a 36% decline on an annualized rate in GDP in the second quarter. We're expecting the economy to bounce back at about 18% growth rate in the third quarter and about 10% in the fourth quarter. So year on year, we're still going to be down. We're not going to recover completely this year. That'll be something for next year. But we will begin to grow again in the third quarter. At least that's what the forecast currently suggests. The complication, well, here for Mexico, also just to mention what things look like for Mexico, there the problem is a little bit complicated because the economy was actually shrinking before the pandemic. It shrunk last year. It shrunk at a hefty pace in the first quarter. And in Mexico, also what we're seeing is a very limited policy response. So they don't have quite the sort of the fiscal firepower that the United States government has, certainly. And so they're not going to have enough policy response to sort of limit some of the hurt and harm that's going to befall businesses and households. The peso is also down, of course, from February. And then the other thing that's happened in Mexico with sort of the economic downturn is that Moody's has, and other credit rating agencies have downgraded Mexico's debt and certainly Pemex debt. So speaking of oil, that's another problem for our region because for Mexico and for Texas, for Louisiana, for other oil producing states in the US and especially for Mexico, the decline in the oil price that has come with this pandemic, both in the form of the decline in demand for oil and for fuel, but also in the increase in supply, unfortunately, that materialized really in March and April. We've seen just a complete collapse of the oil price. And so what I'm showing you in this chart here is a collapse in the oil price in blue and the collapse in the rig count in red, just so you can see. And this is something, you know, two things that are very highly correlated in the US in particular, but basically it's not worth it for oil producers to drill more wells when the oil price is so low. It's just not profitable. So that's another thing that's going to weigh on revenues of oil companies and of course on the revenues of Pemex in Mexico. All right, the policy responses to the pandemic and to the really the economic downturn have been quite sweeping, both in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy. So the central bank in Mexico and certainly the Federal Reserve have been very aggressive in reducing the policy rate, so slamming down interest rates to lower the cost of borrowing. They've been boosting liquidity to ensure the smooth functioning of credit markets. They're supporting lending programs as best they can to businesses. In Mexico, they're a little bit more limited in what they can do in that regard, but they're doing the most that they can. In terms of fiscal policy, both US and Mexico are offering tax payment deferrals for businesses, which is very helpful. But again, in Mexico, the bandwidth is lesser for fiscal policy. In the US, however, we've really pulled out the stops and we have these large monetary transfers. These stimulus checks have gone out to households. We also have unprecedented record federal supplements to unemployment benefits for workers. That's going to be really helpful. grants and loans to businesses and state and local governments and so forth. So really the response in terms of monetary and fiscal policy in the US will go a long way. What are the implications for trade? Well, all this slowing in the economy and the closure of businesses, the social distancing mandates, the mandates for personal protective equipment, much of that is wreaking havoc on trade. And so trade has declined in the months so far this year. And what I'm showing you here is really the ramifications of that, because here is a picture of the correlation in industrial production in Mexico and the US. And it has a kind of a line for 1994, before NAFTA, after NAFTA. You can just see how synchronized industrial production became in the NAFTA era between US and Mexico. And this means that we are completely dependent on each other on these supply chains. And we really are in a system of production sharing in the United States and Mexico, and also in Canada. And given the extent of production sharing, you can understand that in this pandemic, coming back from the business closures, coming back from the social distancing mandates, et cetera, we're going to need to coordinate that comeback, because these supply chains need to be, again, there's this synchronicity, and so they need to be well timed. We need to come back together. Not clear that we have the bandwidth to do that. But the other thing that's important to note is that, and this is another chart that also drives home the point of the production sharing that's so prevalent in the NAFTA region. This chart is showing you results from an academic paper that tried to figure out, and it's pretty hard to do, but to figure out exactly the US content in imports from Mexico and Canada. And what they came up with was about 40% of the content of imports from Mexico are originally US content. From Canada, about 25% of the content of imports from Canada are US content. And so within the North American region, we see about a third of the content in imports are from the other two trading partners. And this is sort of far greater than we see in terms of the production sharing with China, which looks a lot smaller when you look at intermediate inputs and the US content of imports from China. This just drives home again the point of production sharing and the importance of coming back together. So just to summarize then, sort of my remarks this morning. So COVID-19, the fear of infection, the private and public health measures really have led to historically large and rapid economic decline across North America. In addition to that problem, we have the problem of the sharp oil price declines, which really are making matters worse in energy regions like Texas and Mexico. The policy response in the United States has been unprecedented. It's certainly going to help boost recovery here. In Mexico, they're more limited in what they can do. They're doing what they can, but certainly the policy response there will be, fall short of where it would be, in a perfect world. Trade is slowing, but the successful recovery of trade is going to depend on the coordination of reopening across the supply chain. And my colleagues that follow me on this panel are going to be discussing that in more detail. And lastly, I didn't really have time to cover USMCA implementation, but remember that's sort of going on at the same time. We are in the process of trying to implement USMCA. And we have some research at the Dallas Fed, certainly by my colleague Jesus Cañas, and a recent article that we published that showed that USMCA has its own issues, especially as it comes to motor vehicle manufacturing in the North American region. And so we can certainly raise that, in the Q&A, and the other speakers may touch on that. But that's another looming challenge for us here in terms of following the global supply chains and the disruption from the pandemic. Thank you. Well, with those remarks, I will pass on the mic to Emilio.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pia. Thank you to you, and of course to Rice University and the Baker Institute for this opportunity to share a couple of ideas with you. I think it's great that we do it in terms of the disruption of the supply chains. Although I believe this is a bigger issue of interconnection. I do believe that the biggest message, or the most important message of COVID-19, at least for me, and I believe it should be, it is very relevant for the rest of the world, is that it's saying we are a global interconnected world, so you better learn how to deal with it, and you better learn how to cooperate with it. There is no doubt that this puts in front of us the reality that what happens in China, on Iran, or in the US, or in Mexico is connected to the. With this in mind, I want to share with you two main ideas that are being part of the day-to-day conversations of the US-Mexico foundations with the different stakeholders of this complex trilateral relationship. So I will try to share these ideas with you. The first one is actually how obvious it has become of the global, regional, and local supply chain interdependence. I think it has never been more obvious on how critical this is and how important it is, I'm going to say, for the well-being of people. I think since the end of 2016, when we had, the US election, and I'm going to say a lot of these protectionist and populist ideas coming not only from the United States, but from other places in the world, of course, including Mexico, a little bit after that with the López Obrador election. But it has never been more obvious what we have been talking about for a long time, what we have been preaching in terms of how relevant and how interconnected we are, and why it's very important that we design policy and continue to design policy that allows us to continue to be interconnected. Again, I think it's more than the economics. I think it is what drives the economy. At the end of the day, it drives well-being of people. It's centered in economics, is part of well-being, is not the whole thing, but I think it's very important. So the second thing that I believe it's been very obvious on the interdependence, is how little or how disconnected governments were from really understanding supply chains. And I believe a lot of the decisions taking and a lot of the lack of communication, which I will talk about in a little bit, and the lack of design of support programs, as Pia was saying, especially in Mexico, have a lot to do with how little governments understand what happens on the day-to-day life of industry and other sectors in terms of interconnection. Because I think the other thing that has become very relevant that we have to address is that this interconnection of supply chains is not only about goods and services, it's also about people movement. I think in this point specifically, I think the relationship between the US and Mexico and immigration is very, very relevant, because part of the supply chain is people going to the fields to work in agriculture and to make sure that the supply chain doesn't get disrupted. So it's not only about what's produced in the fields of California, it is about who is producing and who is being part of the workforce, making sure that that happens. So again, these are things that are being very, very obvious. I think the other thing that's being very obvious, and we, Flavio, you and I have talked about this for some time also since 2016, which is how bad we have been at telling the story behind why this interdependence is good and why this interdependence has to be built on, and why trade is good and free trade has been good for the world, I would say, in its majority, always with winners and some losers in this change, as with all changes. But I think this is the other thing that becomes very relevant, is we have to be much better at telling the story behind interdependence of supply chains and interdependence of the world. So I think it's very important that we do not let this momentum go to waste. I think we gotta make sure that this stays in the mainstream conversation. I think when we were trying to lobby for what we call then NAFTA 2.0, now USMCA, we would never imagine, and we insisted on it, on the type of letters that we've gotten from 250 CEOs to the president of Mexico, or the Senate to Pompeo, to be able to push the message of the interdependence of Mexico and the US in its supply chains. So I think it's very important that we do not let this go to waste and that we keep it on, again, on the mainstream conversation, which takes us, in my opinion, to what Julia from the US-Mexico Foundation called the pink dragon in the room, which is China. And I have to say that for most of us, China is not the enemy. I think this is a very dangerous thing that we are doing, where politics takes over, and I will talk also a little bit about this. But for most of us, China is not the enemy. For most of us, China, and I'm going to talk about the Chinese private sector, I'm not talking about the government, but I'm speaking from the private sector point of view. For many of us, Chinese companies are our partners on this complex global supply chain. I would say maybe for some, or for a few of us also, they are very tough competitors that sometimes don't play by the rules, and that must be addressed. But that doesn't mean that China is the enemy. Again, I go to this big message that at least I have from COVID-19. We are connected, and we better deal with this on a cooperative way, not on this adversarial way, because I don't think it's going to take us anywhere. Okay. I believe that regionalization of manufacturing was already a reality, not because of protectionism, not because of policy, but because it makes good sense. And I think, maybe ask Flavio on this, but the auto industry, I think, is the best example of it, where we know that we need to stay close to the market, close to the customer, where more than any other industry, the auto industry has its supply chain around, but that doesn't mean that we buy things from China. And that doesn't mean that we need trade from China. I do believe it makes sense to rethink a regional strategy, but as all strategies, this requires the building of capabilities that cannot be made from one day to the other. So I say, in order for us to rethink the Chinese supply chain strategy, we need the Chinese private sector. Because the other thing that is very important for us to understand is that the Chinese suppliers that we use today are not the same companies that started to manufacture 25 years ago. They have put a lot of time in technology. They have put a lot of time in science. They have put a lot of time in research and development. So again, I think we have to rethink this integration of supply chains from a more cooperative point of view. And yes, from a regional point of view, because it makes sense, because from the environmental footprint that impacts the supply chain when you do it locally and you don't have boats going around the world doing it. And of course, because the market, because the customer drives these decisions and they want unique products made to order quicker again, for them to acquire. So I think this is happening. On this also integration of supply chains, I think based on, Pia, you were presenting some fantastic information and how Mexico is not stepping up to the challenge, maybe because they can't. I think it's because they don't want in some case, because of not understanding businesses better in terms of putting support for companies in this economic crisis. I think the good thing for Mexico is that we are a company that, as you put there in your data, we depend on manufacturing for export. This is the driver of the economy. Fortunately, it's not oil anymore. And fortunately, this is going to depend on the money put by the US, which is in the trillions of dollars now to reestablish the economy. So I do believe that the recovery of Mexico is going to come because we are interconnected to the United States. So by the US putting the money in, recovering its market, our supply chains are going to go up, manufacturing in Mexico is going to go up, and then our integration. And then the second big point that I want to make is, I think that at least I call myself from the NAFTA generation, right? To start to work when NAFTA was implemented. I think we underestimated the role of the leadership of government and the coordination of government because things were flowing, right? Philosophically, I think a lot of them were aligned. So we didn't think of government as being so critical in terms of how they drive what happens with us and what happens with our supply chains. I think now this is a huge challenge. I say that trade and economics are being held hostage by politics, because it's more relevant what you say today in order to gain votes. And again, I'm not speaking only about the US. Mexico certainly is the case, and I think this is a trend all over the world, which is a big concern to me. It's impressive to me. The most impressive thing in terms of government is how little they are connected in terms of dealing with this pandemic. How little cooperation there is between China and the United States and Europe, how little coordination there is among the European Union, and of course, coming to our region, how bad the coordination is among our countries, among the NAFTA, still today, region, in terms of what are the policies, what are the strategies, what are the things that we have to do to contain the pandemic, to keep people healthy, and to reactivate the economy. I think it's too late already to have a plan for the activation of the economy. I think we should have had it long ago, but I think it's impressive to me that we don't talk, that we don't see a press conference of the health departments of the three countries saying this is where we are going. I think as communities, as regional, or this regional community, we have to demand more from our governments to be up to the challenge of what we know is going to be here for some time. Because I still do not see any coordination among our three countries. And not only that, I don't see the coordination between California and Texas, and Texas and Georgia, and of course, with these three states with the White House, as I don't see it in Mexico, between Mexico City and the rest of the states, or the federal government. So I think this is one of the things that has been more obvious. And this is why in the US-Mexico Foundation agenda, the study and the recommendations on the institutional architecture to manage this complex relationship, which includes now the pandemic, is one of the most important things for us to address. There needs to be a much better architecture of how we deal with it, of how we talk among different areas, functions, governments, cities, etc. And by the way, I also believe that it's critical that we have a much better institutional architecture among the private sector. It's not good enough that we talk to the US Chamber or the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and that BRT talks to Consejo Mexicano de Negocios, because I think it's only talking on the urgent matters and by sending letters. I think we need to make sure that we build institutional structures that allow us to have first a vision of what we want from a region, and then an execution plan to see how we get there. I think it's good news that Mexico is starting to give us some information, and this is today, on how we activate our economy, starting next Monday. I think it's really what I would call the start of the economy, at least warming up for it, and with the automotive sector in the driver's seat of that. And with that, I will have just three big conclusions. One is on also things that we have to address is digital as the next big inequality factor. And Pia, you were saying also this. Today, if you don't have access to internet, there is no way you can connect with people and you can work. We need to address this, not only among our countries, where I think certainly Mexico is lagging behind, but also among big corporations to smaller corporations, you know, this all SME conversation. Number two, I think, what is the role of business in society? I think we need to bring it to the agenda. And I think in that, we need to do a fantastic job of bringing the economy back in terms of keeping people safe. If not, I think this is not going to go well. So I think it's very important that we talk about it. And I think there is no margin, lastly, to make mistake on global constructive coordination. We have to do it. People say that life is not going to be the same after COVID-19. I think shame on us if it's the same. I think we have to really, learn from these lessons and make sure that we do things differently. And with this, I will turn it to Flavio so we can talk about more on the automotive sector as an example.
Thank you, Emilio. And again, thanks to the US-Mexico Foundation and Rice University and Baker Institute for including Canadian. You see a beard on my face. It's not as impressive as Emilio's, but mine's here because it snowed in Toronto 2 days ago. And so for all of you in warm climates who are enjoying this webinar, please have some sympathy for the Canadians who joined you today. little bit of context, I think. I run the Automotive Parts Manufacturing Association here in Canada. We represent 300 companies, 1,400 factories, 100,000 employees, and we supply 9 automaker plants here, both vehicle assembly and engine assembly. You know, Emilio and I spent a lot of time together through the NAFTA negotiations, and one theme that we always said was, you can't make cars in any of the 3 countries without getting parts from the other 2 countries. We're so interconnected. We are very likely the largest, most integrated supply chain on the planet. At the time, we did a little bit of a study to see between the 3 countries who are number 2, number 6, and number 10 in global production of vehicles. How many people work in the automotive sector, and why? You know, why did it matter for the NAFTA negotiations, and why does it matter for the post-COVID restart? I shouldn't even say post-COVID, because we won't be post-COVID for some time now, but post initial lockdown restart. There's 3 million people in those 3 countries that work directly in parts manufacture or vehicle manufacture. They're part of a wider market segment of 20 million people who either make, service, supply, distribute, finance, sell vehicles. It's a great microeconomy in a North American population of 500 million people. Where are we right now? You know, we're talking about going back to work. We're beyond talking about that. Here in this country, and certainly in the US, we're going back to work to make cars over the next few weeks. And all clear indications from the president on down in Mexico is that our Mexican partners will join us. They have to. None of us would be successful. We have a lot of production lines stopped with components missing. But where are we in the COVID spread and containment? Canada has 38 million people. Mexico has got 129 million people, and the US has got 331 million people. Mexico has tested 0.03% of its population. So as a sample to understand where the spread is, it's borders on insignificant, immaterial numbers. Really trying to understand what the risk is, you can't really do with that sampling. The US, the president likes to say he's led the world in testing in absolute numbers, but he still tested only 0.4% of the population. It's 1.4 million people. In Canada, we lament that we are, in many parts of this country, falling behind in testing versus where we think it should be, but we've tested 2% of the population. It's important. It's a sample that we understand where the outbreaks are. We are not unaffected, even though Canada has done as well, if not better, than most of the other G20 countries. Montreal, second biggest city in Canada, and a city I'm sure all of you know, is the 5th worst major city in the world in terms of infections. And the province of Quebec has started, was the first out of the gates to restart, but is making a distinction between the province and the city of Montreal. With 11.5% of Canada has about 11.5% of the population that the US has, but only 5% of the infections and 6% of deaths. If you overlay that with the fact that we've tested 5 times as many people, the numbers are much, much better disproportionately. And yet we worry a lot here about the return to work. We worry a lot about the return to work. Are we rushing it? Do we risk a W recovery? Will a W wipe out suppliers who are very short on working capital? These are very, very real concerns. The biggest COVID issue here in Canada is not an internal one. It's our border with the US. And right now, a reopening of the border to the US is the biggest risk between Ontario and Michigan, or Ontario and New York State, or Quebec and New York State. The two of the worst hit regions in the US are New York State and specifically the city of Detroit. So all of the containment efforts that we think are good to get us back to work in the world's most integrated supply chain, materials and people going back and forth between those companies across the borders, are we carrying the risk of a disparate approach to COVID containment and a different taste for risk when we reopen? We have no choice. We must reopen. It's a bit of a chicken and egg here. Do you reopen the economy? Do you reopen an industrial sector that throughout the continent is 20 million people working directly in it? And if you take a look at the impact of that direct labor and spread it out on general population, meaning immediate family, you're probably looking at 10% of the economy across this continent is related to the automotive business, whether it's actual fabrication of the goods or everything else in sales and support of it. Or do you wait for consumers to return? What did we do as an industry? And Emilio said something very important in his conclusions about the role of business in society. The middle of March, the EU announced that it was looking at export restrictions for critical medical goods, including life-saving equipment like ventilators, as well as critical PPEs that were required to keep frontline workers safe. Masks, face shields, gowns, swabs. We, the APMA, did the first call to action. We spoke to provincial governments and the federal government and said, look, if you don't have local sources for these goods, which they didn't, if you can tell us what you need and the volumes you need it, we'll see if the automotive industry, which is unique in its ability to scale, can get into the business of making these products in very short order. This is while we were still making cars, before the market disappeared. Our call to action led to a federal government call to action a week later that referenced the work of the APMA with the federal government as put together this great industry-wide call, as well as the provincial government here in Ontario, which represents about 95% of the auto business. In the end, 165 companies volunteered to do due diligence on whether they had the capacity to do things and whether whether they had the capacity in terms of the physical capacity and then the capacity to do the products. 77 companies put up their hands and made proposals, said let's do it, and about 25 automotive parts suppliers in Canada are making ventilators, masks, shields, gowns, swabs. Swabs in the millions, shields in the tens of millions, masks in the tens of millions, gowns in the hundreds of thousands, and ventilators in the tens of thousands. The effort of this association and this industry was the top story feature in The Economist 2 weeks ago. Why is that important? Well, we talk about governments, and government's only currency is what's in the clips. What are they hearing? What are we doing? And if you're looking as an industry for government support in returning to business, you better have stepped up. What's the role of business in everyday life? It's we stepped up. In this country, the national coverage of the effort is the Step Up movement. But we did it because it was right, but we also did it because there is some currency in the return, being able to influence how we stage the return. Suppliers and automakers in this continent stopped production, not because of COVID-related workplace concerns, although there were outbreaks in the second and third week of March that were real in facilities all over the continent. But we stopped because people stopped buying cars. It's very important to understand that the usual, the automakers work with about a 60 to 70 days worth of inventory on hand at any given time. If you get lower than that, it's dangerous. You've got to run 3 shifts, work overtime to get there. And you run higher than that, and cars and trucks are not like other implements. You can't stockpile them and make a Ford out of them. The average light vehicle inventory in North America is now sitting at 95 days. We can reopen, but are people going to buy cars? And we know that the market is the buying rate is going to be down about 35 to 40%. And so that 95 days is going to put pressure on how that restart happens. We cannot restart sustainably if governments in the 3 countries aren't aligned and companies aren't aligned. All industries, I'll summarize it very quickly, tools, suppliers, assemblers in all 3 countries are working very closely together. Industry associations, as well as in all 3 countries, in all 3 categories, as well as manufacturers, the car makers who have assets in all 3 countries are working, coordinating their assets in those 3 countries with their suppliers in those 3 countries. We're working schedules together to manage that inventory. We're working workplace protocols together, but governments are not aligned. And now, Pia and Emilio spoke a little bit about that, but the approach to COVID containment and testing and mitigation is different in all 3 countries. It's also different because of where the residual powers sit. In Canada, the residual jurisdictional responsibility for health is provincial, and we have a publicly funded healthcare system. We move goods across borders. In Canada, an auto part, the various studies, including one from the Center for Automotive Research in Michigan, said an auto part may travel 8 times across the border before it ends up in a car. In Canada, the Quarantine Act is a piece of legislation that has been enacted that makes non-essential travelers who enter the country be in a forced, enforceable 14-day quarantine. If you are on an essential list as determined by a province, then you would just be responsible for self-isolating and not an enforced quarantine. It's important that we stepped up, that we built PPEs for usage across the country, because in this country, unlike in the other 2 countries, we were able to keep automotive on an essential list. There was no regulatory reason for us to shut down, and in many cases, a lot of automotive suppliers have been working for the last 2 months. In the US, it's CDC quarantine guidance and then the individual states. The view from Canada, I think, is there's the patchwork of rather confusing restarts. And in Mexico, I'll be charitable and say that the situation is fluid. So if you've got specialists that have to go between the 3 countries or trucks that have to go between the 3 countries, the only place you can really predict exactly how those people will be treated is Canada right now. That's not good for us, not good for any of the 3 countries. And then lastly, and I'll end really quickly here on this, is that overlaying on all of this is that the new USMCA is entering into force on July 1st. I've been working very hard to make sure that everybody understands that entry into force doesn't necessarily have to mean and can be distinct from enforcement. We haven't seen the uniform regulations yet. So what are you going to enforce if I don't know exactly what an engine is under, what the HS codes are for engine and core parts in the USMCA as distinct from the NAFTA? All of these things are coming together with real urgency underneath the shadow of the COVID crisis. And my prediction is that we won't see a declaration from Washington, but unless we push them, and the declaration will go the wrong way. But I think we're going to push off enforcement of the new automotive rules of USMCA until January 1st, allowing for companies and supply chains to first do the proper restart and then see the new rules and get there. The US elections are the biggest dynamic here, and we've all been trying to predict what happens out of the White House for the last 4 years. Certainly no specific input here from Canada, other than the fact that that's a risk that has cost money for automotive suppliers and car makers all over North America, a cost that we all absorbed over the last 2-3 years, but I'm not sure that any of us can afford in a W recovery in COVID. With that, I'll end, and I'll ask Enrique to take over.
Thank you, Flavio. Thank you, Pia, and thank you, Emilia, for all your ideas, comments, and presentation. I'll do the questions. We have some questions from the audience. I'll start with you, Pia. You talk about a trade is slowing worldwide, and but my question is if you forecast also a shift from trade. We're seeing some initiatives, even some executive orders like the Production Act in the US. We saw yesterday also an article from Robert Lighthizer talking about offshoring and how to bring this employment back to the US. We can talk about nearshoring. We can talk about a lot of things, but do you forecast a shifting on trade?
I think that we are headed that direction. And I think the main sort of economic momentum for an increase in regional commerce and a decrease in global commerce is that what we've observed in the last few years is that these global supply chains, these global commercial relationships are perhaps far more riskier than we appreciated earlier. And so if they're risky, whether because they're vulnerable to policy changes like we've seen in the United States recently or and other countries, or if they're vulnerable to things like pandemics, then I think we have to reassess global chains and think more about the motivation for greater regionalization of trade and linkages and migration. But that said, there's a limit to the regionalization that we can implement, and the limit is costs. I mean, there's going to be a point at which it's too costly to manufacture things like ourselves. And so if you increase the costs too much, you're going to actually have, people deferring back to sort of the global chain. So there's a limit on what we can do. I think there's a trend toward more regionalization and perhaps for some good reasons, but there's a limit. We have to preserve sort of the sound economics even within regions, as we have sort of tried to do globally.
Thank you, Pia. To
Enrique,
Emilio,
can I make a quick comment on that? I think
sure.
I agree with Pia, but I think it's more than cost. I think it's also capabilities, as I said. It is not easy to find, more than one supplier or more than two suppliers around the world for complex issues like cars or airplanes. So I think it's you would love to, I always say, I would love to have all my suppliers across the street, but that's not necessarily easy in many industries. So I think it's this combination and how we address the issue of cost, the issue of capabilities also in terms of being able to have that ideal supply chain, everybody in the US around Michigan. I don't think we're going to go back to that.
Emilio, let me stay with you with a question from the audience. And the question is, how do you separate out of the Chinese private sector from the Chinese government? I mean, you mentioned during your presentation that Chinese companies could be also a partner. It's not only the enemy.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, I personally don't see China as the enemy on anything. I see them as my competitors in some things. But first of all, it's obvious that line between state and private sector is much grayer in China than it is certainly in the United States, right? I think it's changing around, as time goes by. I think there is more and more global Chinese companies that are going, again, global, that are acquiring other operations in the world, especially I think in the auto side, there's a lot of Chinese companies buying all their operations, inputting technology, know-how. So I think it's, first of all, I think one is the relationship with the company. And I think the other, and this is where I draw the line, is how we work globally on international trade rules, okay? And I think that's where China, we have to pressure China to be a much better team player in terms of transparency of their economy, of how they manage things, on not subsidizing products, because I think that's where unfair competition comes into play and where most of the complaints, at least from the private sector with China, come from. So I think it's the differentiation is, I think, is making sure that the international community makes China as a country play by the rules in terms of international trade. I don't think we're going to change if they have let me say, equity on the businesses or not. But that's why these international trade deals are so important, like USMCA, because it gives us a playing field that we know, that we understand, and that we can monitor and control. So that's kind of my answer.
Thank you, Emilio. Flavio, there is a question for you. Do you see migration of auto companies or auto facilities out of Mexico and into the US and Canada as a result of deficient government policies or initiatives in this moment?
You know, the pressure on potentially reshoring from Mexico comes from a piece of the USMCA that is the labor value content. And the labor value content says any vehicle manufactured in any of the three countries in a facility that pays less than $16 US an hour, and that's the wage, that's not the all-in cost, must source 40% of that content from facilities and jurisdictions that do. Also on that, there are work downs from that 40%. If you do R&D, if you do your R&D work, if you have other admin management level operations, as well, if you do powertrains, you can move that number down to 25. It's important to make those distinctions because the only two automakers I currently think have an issue with that number are Nissan and Mazda. And so there are also, the three countries have allowed for the companies to give a alternative transition plan that says for up to 10% of your production in the content, you can extend the transition from the day one, whether it's July the 1st or January 1st next year, for another 5 years. Those two companies can pick in those transition plans to find those solutions in Mexico. That is either put pressure on your supplier to move some of those critical offset pieces there. OEMs deciding to do more R&D or shift it around. I put a lot of detail into that answer, but I think that's the only place where there's pressure for reshoring. Frankly, the industry works because Mexico is the low cost jurisdiction that North America needs to assemble a globally competitive vehicle. The Europeans aren't finding a way not to source from Poland. And if they did, they'd be shooting themselves in the foot. And a lot of this comes from the policy of the current administration in Washington, but it will be executed by companies that will exist under future jurisdictions. And so I really do think that what we're going to see is a lot of reshoring to the three countries, but I don't think we're going to be picking apart from each other. I think that because the content level in the USMCA is up to 75% on a wider group of qualifying parts from the 62.5 in NAFTA, you're going to see a growth in the US Southeast especially, and maybe hopefully some up here. But I think long-term it will not come at a cost to Mexico. Some of Mexico's growth curves that have been like this over the last few years in automotive may go like this, but there will be none of this.
Thank you, Flavio. Emilio, today, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador and his cabinet presented a plan for reopening on June 1st. Any comments on that?
Well, I think the first comment I would have is that I'm glad that they presented something today. I think as I said, I believe actually it starts next week with, the gradual ramp up of some specific sectors. They also cross this with where they believe that each state and municipality stands in terms of risk of COVID-19. There, as Flavio said, I think there is a lot of doubt on the information and how it's coming. And if you're red or green or yellow, who says that based on the amount of testing we're doing. But I do believe it's great that we have a plan. And the reason why I think so also, and our panelists also talk about the risk of opening the economy. I think staying closed for more than 60 days it has also to do with the ability of the government to finance the shutdown. And what I think Pia said, and I think it's very obvious for Mexico, is that we do not have enough beds to manage people that get sick, but we don't have money to finance a shutdown economy. So I think we are at a bigger risk than certainly Sweden, that sometimes comes into place. And I say, come on, are you really going to compare Mexico to Sweden? It's impossible. I think we are more in the issues that Argentina and Brazil and other places are having. So I think we have to start opening the economy. We need people with jobs. It's very important. And so I like the plan. And most importantly, I do believe that that brings this responsibility that also Flavio talked about on how we manage our preventive system as best as possible. And I think also how we insist to the government that they send the message to people that, yes, go to work, make some money so you can make a living, but then go back home again, right? Not to a party or somewhere else where the problem gets bigger. We, at least on the information that we have and the companies that we manage, where we've been fortunate to have very, very few cases of people being getting COVID-19, none of them, fortunately, passing away. All of them got it because they did something irresponsible, you know, flew to Cancun or went to a party, or we have one case, unfortunately, where right at the beginning, where we probably should have done a little bit different, where somebody is a relative of a nurse, which of course are doing a fantastic job and are heroes today, but very exposed. So right now, anybody that is a relative to a doctor or a nurse is staying home with full pay.
Thank you, Emilia. And Pia, on a follow-up on these comments, there has been a lot of efforts already in many states in the U.S. trying to reopening. Any lessons learned already in the past 2 weeks from Texas, from Colorado, Florida?
It's hard to tell. I mean, what we've seen is that cases have continued to grow of COVID, and certainly are still growing a little bit faster rate in the economy in the states that are reopening than perhaps the national average. But you know, it's clear that there's a cost-benefit trade-off here, and I think there's a responsible way to open back the economy. And I think as long as businesses and consumers are super cautious, you know, hopefully they'll find a way to weigh those costs and benefits, because closing the economy indefinitely is also, you know, very, very costly. And so there is a middle way, a middle ground, and I think that hopefully we'll find our way there. As long as we monitor the data, I think that, you know, everybody wants the best outcome.
Let me finish. I think we have 2 more minutes, Flavio, for our last question. And I'll ask you about the protocols, the best practices, the companies, the facilities. You mentioned 300 companies in the automotive industry in Canada. How can we replicate those best practices in the facilities, with the employees, with the people?
Sure. Look, I think it's common sense. It's an a deployment of common sense. We are in facilities where people work at specific stations. If we can move those stations apart by 2 meters, move where people work by 2 meters, we do it. We're in a business where, for health and safety reasons, we already have restricted areas. So it's a culture of restricting movement where we can't make those, where people have to work in clusters. We want to provide them with personal protective equipment. They don't need N95 masks, but they may be better off with level 2 surgical masks, gloves, face shields, gowns where necessary. Where we have multiple shifts, instead of having people come in and out of a door, you know, the door, like common sense is the door. That's the one place, the bottleneck. We put time between shifts, half an hour between shifts, so people don't congregate in the parking lots as well. And like Emilio said, don't go home to a party. And then the last thing is that there are some very basic scrub down protocols. You want to clean their workplaces, and in automotive it's easier than in an office. You can use some diluted bleach and clean the implements that they're using. But to do a bunch of that with screening on the way in and screening on the way out. And one of the things that we're doing is contact tracing where possible inside the facility. So privacy issues are important for everybody, But if you're in my facility at work, if we can have an app that we can all share, that at least while you're at work, that we know where you're going in the facility. If we do have a positive case, then we know who to contact directly, which ones of the employees to trace it. None of that is, you don't need a chief medical officer for that. That's really common sense of business owners. And we've been very proactive in the industry across the continent to actually share those things. So the last point I leave is, if you're in an industry, you're going to find, for at least for me, unprecedented collaboration on best practices. Call and contact your peers in the other states and countries. Everybody needs a sustainable return. People are really sharing.
Thank you, Flavio. Thank you, Emilio.
Great.
Thank you, Pia. I'll return with Tony Payan for closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Enrique. Well, I want to thank the U.S.-Mexico Foundation and, of course, the Baker Institute for facilitating this event. I want to thank the AV team, Cecilia Zook, for facilitating this. And, of course, I want to thank Flavio, Emilio, and Pia for joining us today. I hope this was of use to you in your decision-making, and that you can anticipate out of what we learned today some of the measures you can take as the economy reopens and we begin to restore the supply chains in North America. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next webinar. We have one on the opening of the USMCA on July 1st, the very day the treaty enters into effect. So we'll be seeing you then, in addition to other webinars that we'll be organizing over time. And thank you, Enrique, for the partnership with the US-Mexico Foundation. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Tony.